He possessed the power to execute traitors with a single command and the authority to silence entire courts with nothing but his gaze. Yet Alpha King Calypso was utterly unprepared for the sound that shattered his midnight silence. He thought he knew his counsel, he thought he knew trust, but when he followed the muffled sobs to his palace kitchen and found the forgotten daughter of his most loyal beta collapsed against the stone hearth, the foundation of his reign crumbled. The scars carved into her back weren't just marks of violence, they were a testament to years of torture signed by the man he called brother. Tonight, the king doesn't just discover a broken girl, he uncovers the ugliest truth of his kingdom, that he built his throne on the suffering of the silent, and he will dismantle everything he's created to make it right. If this story already has you hooked, I need your help to reach 1,000 subscribers and build this community of story lovers. Hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and drop a comment telling me what you think Calypso should do when he discovers the truth. Your support means everything, and trust me, what happens next will leave you speechless. Now let's dive into Cordelia's story. Chapter 1. The palace kitchen was never supposed to be silent at midnight. There were always sounds, the crackle of banked fires, the drip of water into stone basins, the scurry of mice brave enough to risk the cook's wrath. But tonight, the silence pressed against Calypso's ears like a physical weight, broken only by a sound so raw it stopped him mid-stride in the corridor above. Crying. Not the dignified tears of courtiers who wept for strategy, or the loud wails of servants who knew their grief would earn sympathy. This was the sound of someone trying desperately not to exist, each sob swallowed and choked back as if the very act of breathing might betray her. The Alpha King of Dravenmore had ended wars with less hesitation than it took him to descend those stairs. His hand rested on the pommel of his sword, instinct even in his own palace, as he pushed open the kitchen door with enough force to make the hinges groan. She didn't turn around. Cordelia knelt on the cold flagstones before the great hearth, her body curled so tightly around itself she might have been trying to disappear into the shadows. Her simple servant's dress, the color of ash and just as forgettable, had slipped down her shoulders. In the dying firelight, Calypso saw her back. For 3 seconds, his mind refused to process what his eyes were showing him. The scars weren't the clean lines of battle wounds or the random marks of an accident. They were deliberate, methodical. Someone had carved into her flesh with the precision of an artist and the cruelty of a torturer, layer upon layer of raised tissue that formed a landscape of agony across her spine and shoulder blades. Some were old, silvered with time. Others were still pink, still healing. "Who did this to you?" His voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by something he couldn't name. Cordelia's entire body went rigid. She tried to pull her dress back up, fingers fumbling with fabric that seemed to fight her, but Calypso crossed the space between them in 3 strides and caught her wrist. Not hard, he'd never been rough with anyone who didn't deserve it, but firm enough to stop her retreat into invisibility. "Don't," the word was barely a whisper from her lips. "Please, Your Majesty, just don't ask." "I'm not asking." He released her wrist and moved to crouch in front of her instead, forcing her to meet his eyes. Hers were red-rimmed and swollen, her face blotchy with tears she'd tried to hide. He'd seen this woman 100 times in the 3 years since his beta had brought his daughter to court. She'd served his meals, cleaned his chambers, existed in that peculiar space servants occupied, present but invisible, necessary but unremarked upon. He couldn't remember if he'd ever actually spoken to her before tonight. I'm commanding you. Who did this? Something flickered across her face. Fear, yes, but underneath it a bone-deep exhaustion that made her look decades older than her 20-some years. When she spoke, her voice was hollow, scraped clean of everything except the truth she'd been carrying alone. My father. The world didn't stop. That would have been too kind. Instead, it tilted sideways, and Calypso felt himself sliding off the edge of everything he thought he knew. Marcus? Your father? Marcus? Yes. She pulled her dress up properly now, covering the evidence, but the damage was done. Calypso could still see those scars every time he blinked. My father, your Beta, the man you trust with your life and your kingdom. He stood abruptly, needing distance, needing air, needing anything except the way she was looking at him, like she expected this, like his shock was somehow predictable and disappointing all at once. That's impossible. Marcus is... He served me for 15 years. He saved my life in battle. She sold me. Cordelia's voice was still quiet, but there was something new in it now. Not quite strength, but maybe the absence of the fear that had been holding her together. My father. The Alpha King of Dravenmore had ended wars with less hesitation than it took him to descend those stairs. His hand rested on the pommel of his sword, instinct even in his own palace, as he pushed open the kitchen door with enough force to make the hinges groan. She didn't turn around. Cordelia knelt on the cold flagstones before the great hearth, her body curled so tightly around itself she might have been trying to disappear into the shadows. Her simple servant's dress, the color of ash and just as forgettable, had slipped down her shoulders. In the dying firelight, Calypso saw her back. For 3 seconds, his mind refused to process what his eyes were showing him. The scars weren't the clean lines of battle wounds or the random marks of an accident. They were deliberate, methodical. Someone had carved into her flesh with the precision of an artist and the cruelty of a torturer, layer upon layer of raised tissue that formed a landscape of agony across her spine and shoulder blades. Some were old, silvered with time. Others were still pink, still healing. Who did this to you? His voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by something he couldn't name. Cordelia's entire body went rigid. She tried to pull her dress back up, fingers fumbling with fabric that seemed to fight her, but Calypso crossed the space between them in 3 strides and caught her wrist. Not hard, he'd never been rough with anyone who didn't deserve it, but firm enough to stop her retreat into invisibility. Don't. The word was barely a whisper from her lips. Please, Your Majesty, just don't ask. I'm not asking. He released her wrist and moved to crouch in front of her instead, forcing her to meet his eyes. Hers were red-rimmed and swollen, her face blotchy with tears she'd tried to hide. He'd seen this woman 100 times in the 3 years since his Beta had brought his daughter to court. She'd served his meals, cleaned his chambers, existed in that peculiar space servants occupied, present but invisible, necessary but unremarked upon. He couldn't remember if he'd ever actually spoken to her before tonight. I'm commanding you. Who did this? Something flickered across her face. Fear, yes, but underneath it a bone-deep exhaustion that made her look decades older than her 20-some years. When she spoke, her voice was hollow, scraped clean of everything except the truth she'd been carrying alone. My father. The Alpha King of Dravenmore had ended wars with less hesitation than it took him to descend those stairs. His hand rested on the pommel of his sword, instinct even in his own palace, as he pushed open the kitchen door with enough force to make the hinges groan. She didn't turn around. Cordelia knelt on the cold flagstones before the great hearth, her body curled so tightly around itself she might have been trying to disappear into the shadows. Her simple servant's dress, the color of ash and just as forgettable, had slipped down her shoulders. In the dying firelight, Calypso saw her back. For 3 seconds, his mind refused to process what his eyes were showing him. The scars weren't the clean lines of battle wounds or the random marks of an accident. They were deliberate, methodical. Someone had carved into her flesh with the precision of an artist and the cruelty of a torturer, layer upon layer of raised tissue that formed a landscape of agony across her spine and shoulder blades. Some were old, silvered with time. Others were still pink, still healing. "Who did this to you?" His voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by something he couldn't name. Cordelia's entire body went rigid. She tried to pull her dress back up, fingers fumbling with fabric that seemed to fight her, but Calypso crossed the space between them in 3 strides and caught her wrist. Not hard, he'd never been rough with anyone who didn't deserve it, but firm enough to stop her retreat into invisibility. "Don't." The word was barely a whisper from her lips. "Please, Your Majesty, just don't ask." "I'm not asking." He released her wrist and moved to crouch in front of her instead, forcing her to meet his eyes. Hers were red-rimmed and swollen, her face blotchy with tears she'd tried to hide. He'd seen this woman 100 times in the 3 years since his beta had brought his daughter to court. She'd served his meals, cleaned his chambers, existed in that peculiar space servants occupied, present but invisible, necessary but unremarked upon. He couldn't remember if he'd ever actually spoken to her before tonight. "I'm commanding you. Who did this?" Something flickered across her face. Fear, yes, but underneath it,
"Why didn't you tell anyone?" The question came out before he could stop it, and he immediately hated himself for asking, as if the answer wasn't written in every healed wound on her body, in every carefully neutral expression she'd worn while her father sat at Calypso's right hand. But Cordelia answered anyway, with the patience of someone who'd asked herself the same question 1,000 times. "Who would I tell, Your Majesty? You? The king who elevated my father to beta, who trusts him with military secrets and the safety of the realm? The guards he commands? The servants who know better than to cross a man with that much power?" She met his eyes again, and this time there was no fear in them, only a terrible, empty clarity. "I am no one, the worthless daughter of a great man. Even if you believed me, and why would you, it would be my word against his, and we both know whose word carries weight in Dravenroar." Calypso wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that justice existed in his kingdom, that he protected the weak and punished the wicked, that she should have trusted him, but the words died in his throat, because standing there, looking at the evidence of years of torture that had happened under his roof, served his meals while her back screamed with pain, he couldn't claim any of that was true. "Show me again," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "The scars. I need to see them again." Cordelia's hands trembled as she reached for the ties of her dress, but she didn't hesitate. Perhaps she'd moved beyond hesitation into some territory where nothing mattered anymore, where exposure was just one more indignity in a long line of them. She turned around and let the fabric fall to her waist. This time, Calypso looked with purpose. He catalogued every mark, every raised line of tissue, every place where the whip or blade, or whatever instrument of torture Marcus had chosen, had bitten into his daughter's flesh. Some scars crossed each other, suggesting repeated punishments in the same locations. Others were isolated, carefully placed to maximize pain while remaining hidden beneath clothing. And there, just below her right shoulder blade, was something that made Calypso's blood turn to ice in his veins. A brand. Not large, perhaps 2 inches across, but unmistakable in its design. The crest of House Thorn, Marcus's family sigil, a wolf's head in profile, jaws open in eternal snarl. The same symbol Marcus wore on his armor, displayed on his banners, stamped on his official correspondence. He'd marked her, branded her like cattle, like property, like something that belonged to him so completely that even her skin had to declare his ownership. "He did that the night he brought me back from Silas," Cordelia said quietly, as if she'd felt his gaze settle on that particular scar. "Said I needed to remember who I belonged to, that I might have been sold like a slave, but I was still a thorn, and thorns don't forget their place." Calypso reached out before he could stop himself, his fingers hovering just above the brand without quite touching it. The skin there was puckered and twisted, the burn having gone deep enough to destroy the tissue beneath. It would have been agonizing. It would have taken weeks to heal, and every movement would have torn the scabs open again. "Cover yourself," he said finally, his shands shaking, with rage, with horror, with something that felt dangerously close to grief. "I need to think." Cordelia pulled her dress back up with practiced efficiency, tying the laces with fingers that no longer trembled. Whatever vulnerability she'd shown was tucked away again, hidden behind the blank servant's mask she'd worn for 3 years. "Of course, Your Majesty. Will that be all?"
No. The word came out sharper than he intended. "That will not be all. You will stay in these kitchens tonight. You will not go back to the servants' quarters. You will not see your father, and you will not leave this room until I come back for you. Do you understand?" For the first time since he'd found her, something like hope flickered across Cordelia's face. It was fragile and uncertain, the hope of someone who'd learned not to trust it, but it was there. "You believe me?" It wasn't a question, but Calypso answered it anyway. "I saw you. I see you now, and yes, I believe you." He moved toward the door, his mind already racing through everything that needed to happen next, but stopped with his hand on the latch. "Cordelia, how many others are there?" She didn't pretend not to understand. "Girls my father sold, or girls he bought back and brought to the palace?" The distinction made Calypso's stomach turn. "Both." "I don't know about the first. Silas runs his business carefully, and we weren't allowed to talk about where we came from or who sent us." She paused, considering. "But there are 3 other women in the palace whose fathers serve on your council, women who appeared suddenly after long absences, who move like they're afraid to take up space, who flinch when men raise their voices. I think my father isn't the only one who found a convenient way to pay his gambling debts." Calypso closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against the cool wood of the door. His kingdom, his court, his blindness. Their names. She told him. 3 names of women he'd seen and never looked at, 3 more ghosts haunting his palace while he'd played at being a just and noble king. When she finished, the silence stretched between them like a chasm. "Lock this door behind me," he said finally. "Don't open it for anyone except me. Not the cook, not the other servants, and especially not your father. If he comes looking for you, you stay silent. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Majesty." He left her there in the kitchen with its dying fire and its shadows, and as he climbed back up the stairs toward the world he thought he knew, Calypso felt the weight of his crown for the first time in 15 years. Not the physical weight of gold and jewels, but the crushing burden of responsibility for every soul in his kingdom, even the ones he'd been too arrogant or too stupid to see. Marcus was in his chambers, probably sleeping soundly with the confidence of a man whose secrets were safe. The beta quarters were in the eastern wing, close enough to the king's chambers that Marcus could respond quickly in case of emergency, close enough that he'd brought his tortured daughter back to live under the same roof where he'd burned his crest into her skin.
Calypso's claws were still extended as he walked through the midnight palace, his wolf prowling just beneath his skin, demanding blood and justice and revenge. But underneath the rage was something colder and more dangerous, the terrible clarity that came from having your world shattered and seeing, for the first time, what had always been there in the cracks. He'd built his reign on loyalty and strength, on the bonds between him and his inner circle, on trust that seemed unshakable. And all of it, every bit of it, had been built on sand, on the silent suffering of women whose pain was too inconvenient to notice, whose voices were too insignificant to hear, whose bodies bore the evidence of crimes his own court had committed while he'd looked the other way. Not anymore. The beta's door loomed ahead of him in the darkness, solid oak banded with iron, the wolf's head crest carved into the wood, the same crest that marked Cordelia's back. Calypso's hand closed around the latch, and somewhere deep in his chest, something fundamental shifted. He'd come into this night as a king who thought he knew his kingdom. He'd leave it as something else entirely.
Chapter 2. Calypso didn't knock. Kings didn't announce themselves, especially not at 3 in the morning when rage had burned through shock and settled into something colder, more surgical. He pushed open the door to his private study and found exactly who he'd summoned waiting in the shadows. "Your Majesty." Sienna rose from the chair by the window, her movement fluid despite the hour. She was his spy master, a woman who'd spent 20 years collecting secrets the way other people collected debts. Her face was unremarkable by design, the kind that slipped from memory the moment you looked away, perfect for someone whose job was to be forgotten. "Your message said it was urgent." "Sit." Calypso moved to his desk, not bothering with the usual pleasantries. There was a locked drawer in the bottom left corner that only 2 people in the kingdom could open. He was one of them. Inside were files on every member of his council, every noble family, every person who held power in Dravenmoor. Insurance, Sienna called it. Leverage, if he was being honest. He pulled out the folder marked with the thorn crest and dropped it on the desk between them. "Tell me everything you know about Marcus Thorne that isn't in here." Sienna's expression didn't change, but her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the arm of her chair. In the language of spies, that meant she knew something and had been waiting for him to ask. "That's a dangerous question at 3 in the morning, Your Majesty." "Answer it anyway." She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes steadying his face with the intensity of someone reading a text in a foreign language. Whatever she saw there made her decision for her. "The gambling debts. You want to know about the gambling debts." Calypso's claws extended, gouging small furrows in the wooden desk. "Keep talking." "Marcus has been playing deep in the underground dens for about 6 years. Started small, a few gold coins here and there, the kind of losses a beta can absorb without anyone noticing. But it escalated. By the time his daughter turned 16, he owed approximately 40,000 gold marks to various creditors." She paused, letting the number sink in. It was more than most nobles earned in 5 years. The debts disappeared overnight. No record of payment, no seizure of assets, nothing. One day he's drowning, the next day he's clean. Because he sold Cordelia. Saying it out loud made it real in a way it hadn't been before, even after seeing her scars. To a man named Silas, who runs a trafficking house in the lower districts. Sienna's mask slipped for just a second, surprise flashing across her features before she locked it down again. "You know about Silas." I know what Cordelia told me 3 hours ago in my kitchen. I know her back looks like a map of hell, and her father branded her with his family crest like she was livestock. What I don't know is how the head of my intelligence network didn't think to mention that my beta was selling his own daughter into sexual slavery. His voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, which was always more dangerous than shouting. Because I didn't know he'd sold her. Sienna leaned forward, her own carefully controlled composure cracking at the edges. I knew about Silas. He's been operating for years, too well connected to touch without starting a war with half the merchant guilds in the city. I knew girls disappeared into that house and rarely came out. I even knew some of those girls came from noble families fallen on hard times. But the transactions are handled through intermediaries, coded names, cash exchanges that leave no trail. By the time a girl arrives at Silas's door, her past has been scrubbed clean. No records, no witnesses, no proof. Cordelia said there are 3 other women in this palace, daughters of my council members who vanished and then reappeared. Calypso slid a piece of parchment across the desk with 3 names written in his own hand. Find out everything, where they went, who sold them, when they came back, and what happened to them in between. I want names, dates, and documentation, and I want it before dawn. Sienna took the parchment, scanning the names with the quick efficiency of someone used to memorizing information at a glance. This will require breaking into private chambers, questioning servants who've been trained to keep silent, possibly torturing people for information they've been paid to forget. If word gets out that you're investigating your own counsel, then make sure word doesn't get out. Calypso stood, pacing to the window that overlooked the eastern courtyard. Marcus's chambers were dark, a single candle guttering in the window. Was he sleeping soundly, dreaming peaceful dreams, while his daughter huddled in a locked kitchen, terrified he'd come looking for her? His voice was now quieter than a whisper, but it held a sharp edge. I also need everything you can find on Marcus's finances, not the official records. Those will be doctored. I need the real ledgers, the hidden accounts, every transaction he's made in the last 10 years. Follow the money backward from Silas and see where it leads.
That's going to take more than a few hours, Your Majesty. Then assemble your best people. Tell them it's a matter of kingdom security. Tell them whatever you need to tell them to make this happen fast and quiet. He turned back to face her, and whatever she saw in his expression made her flinch. Because if what I suspect is true, if Marcus has been using his position to traffic young women, if other council members are involved, if this goes as deep as I think it does, then we're not just dealing with one man's crimes. We're dealing with a conspiracy that's been operating under my nose for years. Sienna stood, tucking the parchment into a hidden pocket in her cloak. And if the investigation proves your beta is guilty, he's not just your second in command, he's your friend. You've known him since you were boys. The court expects justice. Calypso's voice cut through her words like a blade through silk. So do I. Marcus's friendship ended the moment he put his hands on his daughter. Now he's just another criminal who needs to be stopped before he hurts anyone else. She studied him for another long moment, then nodded once, sharp and final. I'll have preliminary findings by dawn. The full investigation will take 3 days, maybe 4 if they've been careful about covering their tracks. You have 2 days. He moved back to his desk, pulling out another folder, this one unmarked. One more thing. I need you to find someone for me, a man named Silas who runs a trafficking operation in the lower districts. I need to know where he operates, who protects him, how many girls he's currently holding, and every single person who's bought or sold through his house in the last 6 years.
That's suicide. Sienna didn't raise her voice, but there was an edge to it now, the closest she ever came to insubordination. Silas has protection at every level. City guards, magistrates, probably members of your own court. If he realizes someone's investigating him, the girls in that house will disappear. Not relocated, not sold elsewhere. Disappeared permanently, along with any evidence they ever existed.
Which is why you're going to be very, very careful. Calypso met her eyes across the desk, letting her see the wolf prowling just beneath his skin. But I want him. I want his records, his client lists, his bank accounts, every piece of leverage he's accumulated over the years. And then I want him in chains in my dungeon, alive and able to testify about every noble bastard who's ever walked through his door. Sienna's expression shifted into something that might have been respect or might have been fear. With her, it was always hard to tell. This is going to burn your court to the ground, you realize that. If even half of what you suspect is true, we're looking at executions, exiles, complete restructuring of your council. The instability alone could trigger challenges to your authority from rival packs. Let them challenge. He said it simply, a statement of fact rather than bravado. I'd rather rule over ashes than continue presiding over a kingdom built on the suffering of women no one bothered to protect. Now go, you're wasting time I don't have. She left without another word, slipping out the door and into the pre-dawn darkness like smoke dissipating. Calypso waited until her footsteps faded completely before allowing himself to sink back into his chair, suddenly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the late hour. He'd sent his spy master to investigate his oldest friend. In 2 days, maybe less, he'd have proof of crimes that would require execution. The bond between Alpha and Beta was supposed to be sacred, unbreakable. Marcus had saved his life in battle, had stood beside him during the dark years after his father's death, had helped him build Dravenmore into the strongest pack in the Northern Territories. And all of it, every moment of loyalty, every act of friendship, every memory they'd built together, was now tainted by the image of Cordelia's scarred back and the brand burned into her skin. The night stretched on. Calypso didn't sleep. Instead, he began going through the official records himself, looking for the gaps Sienna would be searching for in the shadows. Marcus's financial reports were pristine, too pristine. No one managed money that perfectly, not unless they were hiding a second set of books somewhere. There were unexplained absences in his schedule, meetings with unnamed contacts, trips to the lower districts that were logged as personal business. How had he missed this? How had he sat across from Marcus at 1,000 council meetings, shared wine with him, trusted him with military secrets and the security of the realm, and never once noticed the monster underneath? But he knew the answer to that question. He hadn't looked. Cordelia had been right about that in the kitchen. She was no one, the worthless daughter of a great man, and her suffering had been too inconvenient to notice. How many times had he seen her? How many times had she served his meals with those scars hidden beneath her dress, with her father sitting at the same table, and Calypso had simply looked through her like she was furniture? The shame of it was almost worse than the rage. Dawn was beginning to gray the eastern sky when a soft knock sounded at his door. Not Sienna, she never knocked. He crossed the room and opened it to find Thomas, one of his younger guards, looking uncomfortable. "Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion, but Beta Marcus is asking for an audience. He says it's urgent." Of course he was. Cordelia hadn't returned to the servants' quarters, and Marcus would have noticed her absence. Calypso's first instinct was to refuse, to keep Marcus at a distance until Sienna returned with evidence that would make his guilt undeniable. But that would raise suspicions, and the last thing he needed was for Marcus to realize he was being investigated. "Tell the Beta I'll see him in 1 hour. I need to attend to something first." He closed the door before Thomas could respond and moved back to his desk, his mind already racing through the conversation to come. He'd have to pretend, have to sit across from Marcus and act like nothing had changed, like he hadn't spent the night cataloging his crimes, like Cordelia's scars weren't burned into his memory. The thought made his wolf snarl with frustration. Everything in him demanded immediate confrontation, immediate justice, the kind of brutal reckoning that ended with blood on the floor and a traitor's body cooling in the courtyard. But he was a king before he was a wolf, and kings didn't act on emotion alone, no matter how justified. They gathered evidence, they built cases, they made absolutely certain that when they struck, the blow landed true and final.
So he would play his part, would smile at Marcus and discuss council business and kingdom affairs, while Sienna's people tore through the beta's life looking for proof of his guilt. Would pretend for just a little longer that his oldest friend wasn't a monster who deserved to burn. Calypso looked down at his hands and realized they were shaking, not with fear, not with uncertainty, with the terrible, crystal-clear knowledge that in 2 days, maybe less, he was going to have to choose between mercy and justice. And for the first time in his reign, he knew exactly which one he'd choose. Chapter 3. Calypso returned to the kitchen as the first pale light of dawn began seeping through the high windows. He'd survived an hour with Marcus, an hour of discussing border patrols and grain shipments and council votes, while his beta sat across from him, concerned and attentive, asking if the king had slept poorly. Marcus had mentioned casually that his daughter seemed to have taken ill and wasn't performing her duties. Had anyone seen her? The king had lied smoothly, said he'd heard she'd been reassigned to the laundry for the day, that the head cook had complained about her work. Marcus had nodded, satisfied, and moved on to discuss troop rotations, as if his daughter's absence was no more concerning than a misplaced document. Now Calypso stood outside the kitchen door, his hand on the latch, trying to calm the rage still burning in his chest. He knocked softly, a king knocking on a door in his own palace, asking permission to enter a space he owned. The irony wasn't lost on him. "It's Calypso." He kept his voice low. "You can open the door." The sound of the bolt sliding back was followed by silence. When he pushed the door open, he found Cordelia exactly where he'd left her, huddled by the hearth, though the fire had long since died to ash. She looked smaller somehow in the morning light, more fragile, as if confessing her truth had cost her whatever strength had been holding her upright. "Has he come looking for you?" Calypso closed the door behind him and slid the bolt home again. 3 times. Her voice was hoarse, scraped raw from crying or not crying, he couldn't tell which. He knocked and called my name, said I was being insubordinate, said there would be consequences if I didn't open the door immediately. She looked up at him then, and her eyes were hollow. "I stayed quiet like you told me to, but he knows something's wrong." "Let him know." Calypso crossed to where she sat and lowered himself to the floor beside her, ignoring the way his formal coat dragged in the stone dust. Kings didn't sit on kitchen floors, but he was tired of the distance his crown created between him and the truth. "I need you to tell me everything, Cordelia. Not fragments, not pieces. Everything that happened from the moment your father took you to Silas until the moment I found you here last night. And I need you to understand that nothing you say will leave this room without your permission, but I also need it all, every detail, no matter how painful." She drew her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them like she was trying to hold herself together.
Why? You already believe me. I saw it in your face last night. So why does it matter if you know the details? Because details are what build cases that hold up under scrutiny. Because when I bring charges against your father, his allies will claim you're lying, that you're mentally unstable, that you're seeking attention or revenge. They'll demand proof, and your word alone, no matter how true, won't be enough. He paused, making sure she was looking at him. But if I know everything, if I can corroborate your story with evidence my spy master is gathering right now, then there's no defense, no way for him to twist the truth into something that protects him. You're really going to charge him? She said it like she was testing the words, seeing if they could possibly be real. I'm going to do more than that, but I need your help. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and covered her hand with his. Her fingers were ice cold, despite the hours she'd spent by the fire. Start at the beginning, the night he took you to Silas. What happened? Cordelia was quiet for so long he thought she might refuse. Then she began to speak, her voice flat and mechanical, as if she were reciting someone else's story. It was 2 weeks after my 16th birthday. He came to my room in the middle of the night and told me to pack a bag, said we were going on a trip, that it was pack business and I needed to come with him. I believed him because he was my father, because I thought that meant something. She laughed, a bitter sound that had nothing to do with humor. We walked through the lower districts for an hour. He didn't speak, just kept his hand on my arm, grip tight enough to bruise. When we got to Silas's house, he knocked 3 times, paused, then knocked twice more. A code. Calypso committed the detail to memory. What did the house look like? Old. Stone walls, iron bars on the windows, a door that looked like it could withstand a siege. Inside was, closed her eyes, clean. That's what I remember most. It was spotless, like someone had scrubbed away any evidence that terrible things happened there. Silas met us in the entry hall. He was shorter than my father, round-faced, with soft hands that looked like they'd never done a day's hard labor. He smiled at me like we were old friends. What did he say?
He said, "Welcome, my dear. Your father has told me so much about you." Then he turned to my father and said, "The standard rate for a virgin of good breeding is 20,000 gold marks. I can have the contracts drawn up within the hour." That's when I realized what was happening. That's when I tried to run. Her hand had started trembling under his. Calypso tightened his grip, anchoring her. But you didn't get away. My father caught me before I reached the door. He hit me, not in the face, never in the face where people could see, but in the ribs, hard enough that I couldn't breathe. Then he dragged me into a room Silas called the preparation chamber, and She stopped, swallowing hard. They inspected me, made me undress, checked my teeth like I was a horse at market, looked for scars or blemishes that would lower my value. Silas had a ledger where he recorded everything: height, weight, hair color, whether I was intact. My father stood there the entire time and watched, didn't flinch, didn't look away, just watched his daughter being cataloged like inventory. Calypso felt his claws extend again, digging into his own palm this time to keep from putting his fist through the stone wall. And then my father signed papers. Silas gave him a purse of gold coins. I remember the sound they made, clinking together like wind chimes. My father counted them twice to make sure it was the full amount. When he left, he didn't say goodbye, didn't tell me to be good or that he'd come back for me. He just walked out, and Silas locked the door behind him.
The next part came faster, words tumbling over each other like she needed to get them out before she lost her nerve. She told him about the first night, locked in a windowless room with 3 other girls who wouldn't speak to her. About the rules Silas had: no talking unless spoken to, no looking buyers in the eye, no crying where anyone could hear. About the punishments for breaking those rules, punishments that involved days without food, hours locked in a cellar so small you couldn't stand up straight, beatings administered by Silas's enforcers who knew exactly how to hurt without leaving marks that would damage the merchandise. She told him about the buyers who came to inspect the girls, rich merchants looking for personal servants, minor nobles who wanted someone to warm their beds without the complication of an official mistress, even a few women who purchased girls as companions for their husbands, preferring to control the transaction rather than risk an affair. They would walk through the house like it was a shop, pointing at whichever girl caught their fancy, asking Silas to have her turn around, lift her skirts, open her mouth so they could see her teeth.
I was there for 3 weeks before someone bought me, Cordelia said, her voice growing even more distant. A merchant named Aldrich who dealt in spices from the Southern Territories. He paid $30,000, more than my father had gotten, because I was young and educated, and Silas had trained me not to flinch when men touched me. I lived in Aldrich's house for 18 months. During the day, I cleaned and cooked and pretended to be a normal servant. At night, I did whatever he wanted and pretended I didn't exist. Did he hurt you? Not the way my father did later. Aldrich wasn't cruel for cruelty's sake. He just didn't see me as human. I was a thing he'd purchased, like his furniture or his horses. He used me the way you'd use any tool, casually, without thought, and when he was done, he put me away until he needed me again. She looked down at her hands. Sometimes I think that was worse than the beatings. At least when someone hits you, they're acknowledging you exist enough to hate. Aldrich didn't even care enough for that. What happened after Aldrich? He died, heart failure during a business trip to the coast. His wife, who'd known exactly what I was but had looked the other way as long as I stayed out of sight, sold me back to Silas within a week. The second time was worse because I knew what to expect. I spent 6 more months in that house before my father came back. Calypso had to ask, even though he dreaded the answer. Why did he come back? Someone at court had started asking questions. I never found out who, but apparently having a daughter who'd vanished without explanation was becoming inconvenient for his position. So he paid Silas 40,000 gold marks, double what he'd gotten for me, and brought me home. Her laugh was sharp and broken. I thought, for about 30 seconds, I thought maybe he'd missed me. Maybe he'd realized what he'd done and wanted to make it right. Then we got back to his chambers and he locked the door. She didn't continue immediately. Calypso waited, giving her time, watching the way her breathing had gone shallow and rapid. He said I'd embarrassed him, that I'd cost him twice what I was worth, that I was damaged goods now, worthless except for the most menial labor, and that I needed to understand my place. Cordelia's hand moved to her ribs, pressing against the fabric of her dress. That's when he carved his crest into me. Not with a brand, he'd do that later, but with a knife. He said every time I looked at it, I should remember that I belonged to House Thorn, and Thorns didn't forget their debts. Show me. Calypso's voice was barely above a whisper. She stood slowly, her movements careful, and unlaced the side of her dress. The fabric fell away to reveal her ribs, and there it was,
the wolf's head crest of House Thorn, carved into her flesh with enough precision that every detail was visible. The scar tissue had healed, raised and angry, the lines thick and deliberate. It would have taken hours to carve something that intricate, hours of holding her down while she screamed and begged and bled. "He did this over 3 nights," Cordelia said, her voice detached, clinical. "A little bit each time so I wouldn't pass out from the pain and ruin his work. He said it was art, that he was making me beautiful in the only way something broken could be beautiful." Calypso stood, needing to move, needing to do something with the rage threatening to burst through his skin. He paced to the far side of the kitchen, putting distance between them before his wolf took over completely. When he finally trusted himself to speak, his voice was rough. "What else? What other scars are there that I need to know about?" She showed him. One by one, she revealed the map of torture her father had drawn on her body. The brand on her back she'd already shown him, long, thin scars on her thighs from a cane Marcus had used when she was insolent, circular burns on her shoulders from where he'd put out cigars when he was drunk, a jagged mark across her collarbone where he'd held a knife to her throat and told her that if she ever told anyone what he'd done, he'd finish what he'd started and make sure her body was never found. By the time she was done, Calypso had counted 43 distinct scars, 43 separate acts of torture spread out over 2 years. His beta, his friend, his most trusted advisor, had spent 2 years systematically destroying his own daughter, and Calypso had never noticed, had never asked why Cordelia moved so carefully, why she kept her eyes down, why she flinched whenever Marcus raised his voice in council meetings. "I need to know one more thing," he said finally, turning back to face her. She'd retied her dress and was standing by the hearth again, arms wrapped around herself. "The 3 other women I mentioned to you last night, the ones whose fathers are on my council, did you see them? At Silas's house or after, in the palace?" Cordelia nodded slowly. "I saw 2 of them at Silas's. We weren't allowed to talk, but you recognize faces when you're all living the same nightmare. The 3rd one, I didn't see her at the house, but I know her father, Lord Brennan, lost everything in the same gambling dens my father frequented, and I know his daughter disappeared for almost a year before suddenly reappearing as a kitchen servant. The look in her eyes." She met Calypso's gaze. "You can always tell. Once you know what to look for, you can always tell who's been where I've been. Their names again. I need you to say them out loud. Elena, daughter of Lord Brennan, Mira, daughter of Councilman Thaddeus, and Joanna, daughter of General Royce." She recited them like a prayer or a curse. "4 of us that I know of for certain. But, Your Majesty, if my father did this, if these other men did this, how many others are there that I don't know about? How many girls were sold and never came back? How many are still locked in that house right now, waiting for someone to buy them?" It was the question that had been haunting Calypso since he'd left his meeting with Sienna. His investigation had started with 1 woman's suffering and had already expanded to 4. How deep did this go? How many of his trusted nobles had used their daughters as currency? How many girls had vanished into Silas's house and simply ceased to exist? "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I'm going to find out. Every single one of them, and every man who participated in this, who bought or sold or looked the other way, is going to answer for it." Cordelia looked at him with something that might have been hope or might have been disbelief. "You can't save everyone, Your Majesty. Some girls are already gone. Some have been broken so badly they'll never heal. Some—" She stopped, her voice cracking for the first time since she'd started speaking. "Some would rather die than keep living with the memories." "I know." And he did. He knew that justice, when it finally came, would be too late for some. that no amount of punishment could undo what had been done, that some wounds went too deep to ever fully heal. But I can make sure it doesn't happen again. I can make sure that in my kingdom, under my rule, a man who sells his daughter or buys another man's child faces consequences that make the crime unthinkable. That has to be enough, because it's all I have to offer." She studied him for a long moment, this broken girl in her servant's dress with her catalog of scars, and something shifted in her expression. Not trust, not yet, but maybe the possibility of trust, the recognition that someone with power was finally looking at her and seeing a person worth protecting. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you stay here, stay hidden. In 2 days, maybe less, I'll have enough evidence to move against your father and anyone else involved in this conspiracy. When that happens, I'll need you to testify, to stand in front of the court and tell them what you told me." He moved closer, needing her to understand the weight of what he was asking. "It will be the hardest thing you've ever done. They will question you, doubt you, try to tear apart your story. Your father will invoke laws I didn't even know existed to silence you. But if you can stand there and speak your truth, I can make sure he never hurts anyone again." "And if I can't?" Her voice was small. "If I stand up there and I freeze, or I break, or I just can't? Then I'll find another way. But Cordelia," he waited until she looked at him, "I think you're stronger than you know. You survived 2 years in hell and came out still able to feel compassion for the other girls trapped there. You endured 2 more years of torture and didn't break. Whatever happens in that courtroom, you've already proven you can survive anything." She didn't respond, but her shoulders straightened just slightly, enough that Calypso could see the woman she might become if given the chance to heal, if given justice, if given the protection she should have had all along. He left her there with a promise to return before nightfall with food and water and whatever she needed to survive another day in hiding. As he climbed the stairs back to the world of councils and politics and careful pretense, Calypso felt the weight of every scar she'd shown him, every story she'd told, every moment of suffering he'd failed to prevent. In 2 days, Marcus would answer for what he'd done. In 2 days, Calypso would prove that even kings could learn to see the people they'd been taught to overlook. In 2 days, the world would change. But first, he had to survive pretending it hadn't already. Chapter 4. Calypso stood at the window of his private chambers, watching the sun climb higher over Dravenmoor while his council assembled in the great hall below. They were waiting for him, 12 men who controlled the military, the treasury, the grain stores, the very infrastructure that kept his kingdom functioning. Men he'd handpicked for their loyalty and competence. Men he trusted with power because they'd proven themselves capable of wielding it. Men who might have sold their daughters like livestock while he'd looked the other way. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, and for the first time in 15 years of ruling, Calypso didn't recognize the man looking back. He'd always seen himself as just, firm but fair, a king who protected his people and punished those who preyed on the weak. He'd built his reputation on it, had won the loyalty of his pack by proving again and again that merit mattered more than birthright, that he would hear any grievance brought before him, that justice in Dravenmoor was blind to status or wealth. But Cordelia had brought him a grievance written in scar tissue across her back, and he'd never heard it because he'd never thought to listen. 3 years. She'd been in his palace for 3 years, serving his meals, cleaning his chambers, existing in that invisible space servants occupied, necessary but unremarked upon, present but unseen. How many times had she stood beside his table while he ate, while her father sat across from him discussing military strategy? How many times had she refilled his wine glass with hands that trembled from beatings administered the night before? How many times had she moved through his halls with fresh scars hidden beneath her dress, while Calypso had debated grain tariffs and border disputes and completely missed the atrocity happening under his own roof? He couldn't remember her face before last night, couldn't recall a single interaction, a single moment when he'd looked at her directly instead of through her. And the shame of that realization was worse than any defeat he'd suffered in battle, any political miscalculation he'd made in 15 years of ruling. Because this wasn't an enemy he'd failed to anticipate or a conspiracy too clever to detect. This was simple blindness, the kind born from privilege and power and the comfortable assumption that if something terrible was happening, someone would have told him. But who would tell him? The servants who knew their place? The nobles who benefited from the same system that let Marcus torture his daughter without consequence? The guards who'd been trained to look the other way when their superiors committed crimes? Cordelia had been right in the kitchen. She was no one, the worthless daughter of a great man whose suffering was too inconvenient to notice, whose pain was too ordinary to warrant a king's attention. And Calypso had built the court that made her invisible, had created the structures and hierarchies that rewarded silence and punished vulnerability.
Had surrounded himself with men who understood that loyalty meant never questioning, never challenging, never disturbing the comfortable order of things with messy truths about what happened in the shadows. A knock at his door pulled him from the spiral of his thoughts. "Your Majesty, the council is assembled." Calypso didn't turn from the window. "Tell them I'll be down shortly. There's something I need to attend to first." The guard's footsteps retreated. Calypso remained where he was, watching servants move through the courtyard below, carrying linens, hauling water, performing the 1,000 small tasks that kept a palace functioning. He tried to see their faces from this distance, tried to remember if he'd ever learned their names, or asked about their lives, or done anything except accept their labor as his natural due. He couldn't remember a single name. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He was the Alpha King of Dravenmore, a man who prided himself on knowing his pack, on understanding the needs of his people. He could recite the names of every noble family in 3 kingdoms, could remember the battle records of soldiers he'd fought beside years ago, could recall the exact wording of treaties signed before he was born. But he couldn't name the woman who'd made his bed every morning for 3 years, couldn't recall the face of the man who'd served him breakfast for the past decade, couldn't identify the girl who'd cleaned his fireplace or the boy who'd polished his armor, or any of the dozens of people who'd touched his life daily while remaining completely invisible to him. What kind of king did that make him? What kind of man? The answer came swift and brutal, the same kind of man as Marcus. Not in methodology. Calypso had never raised his hand to someone weaker, had never derived pleasure from causing pain, but in the fundamental blindness that allowed such things to happen. Marcus had tortured his daughter because he could, because the system protected him, because no one with the power to stop him would ever look closely enough to see what he was doing. And Calypso had built that system, had rewarded efficiency over compassion, had valued order over justice, had created a court where keeping your head down and your mouth shut was the path to survival, where asking questions was insubordination, where suffering in silence was preferable to disturbing a king who didn't want to be bothered with the messy realities of how his kingdom actually functioned. He thought of all the times he'd dismissed servants' concerns as trivial, all the times he'd told petitioners to take their grievances to lower courts because he had more important matters to attend to. All the times he'd accepted Marcus's word without question because the beta had never given him reason to doubt, and it was easier to trust than to investigate, easier to assume loyalty than to verify it.
3 years ago, Marcus had returned from a mysterious absence with his daughter in tow. Calypso tried to remember if he'd asked any questions. Had he wondered where Cordelia had been? Had he noticed she'd been gone at all? Or had he simply accepted Marcus's explanation, whatever it had been, and moved on to more pressing concerns? He couldn't remember. Couldn't remember a conversation that should have been significant. Couldn't remember being curious or suspicious or even mildly interested in the reappearance of his beta's daughter. She'd simply been there one day, another servant in an endless succession of forgettable faces, and he'd never thought to ask why. The door opened behind him without warning. Calypso turned, ready to reprimand whoever had entered without permission, and found Sienna standing in the doorway with a leather satchel in her hands. Her face was grim. "I have preliminary findings." She closed the door and locked it behind her, which meant the news was bad enough to require absolute privacy. "You're not going to like it." "Tell me anyway." Calypso moved away from the window, suddenly needing to sit down. He sank into the chair by his desk and gestured for her to continue. Sienna set the satchel on the desk between them and began pulling out documents. "Marcus has been operating through a shell company called Thornwood Imports for 6 years. The company officially deals in timber and textiles, but the real transactions are coded in the ledgers I found hidden in a false panel in his study. He's not just gambling, he's financing his habit by selling girls to Silas and taking a percentage of their resale value. Every girl he sold, he got back 15% when Silas found a buyer." The room tilted. Calypso gripped the arms of his chair to keep from standing up and putting his fist through the nearest wall. He was profiting, not just paying debts, but actively making money from trafficking. "It gets worse." Sienna pulled out another document, this one covered in cramped handwriting. "The 3 women you asked me to investigate, Elena, Mira, and Joanna, their fathers are all part of the same operation. They meet monthly in a private room above a tavern in the merchant district. They call themselves the Investment Circle. The investments they're discussing are their own daughters." Calypso's claws had fully extended now, gouging deep grooves in the wooden armrests. "How many girls total?" "That I can confirm? 17 over the past 6 years. That's just from the coded ledgers I found in Marcus's study. If the other council members kept similar records..." She trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. 17 girls, 17 daughters sold by their own fathers, treated as nothing more than assets to be liquidated when gambling debts came due. And every single one of those fathers sat on Calypso's council, advised him on matters of state, looked him in the eye and lied with the ease of long practice. "I need names." His voice sounded strange even to himself, hollowed out and cold. "Every father involved, every girl sold, every buyer who participated. I need documentation that will hold up in a public trial." "I'll have it within 24 hours. Sienna paused, her expression careful. "But, Your Majesty, you need to understand what you're about to do. If you expose this, if you bring charges against 4 members of your council simultaneously, you're going to create a power vacuum. These men control significant portions of your military and economy. Their families have allies, connections, people who will see this as a political purge rather than justice." "Then let them see it however they want." Calypso stood, needing to pace, needing to move before the rage building in his chest exploded outward. I don't care about the political fallout. I don't care if it destabilizes the court or creates enemies or costs me allies. What I care about is that for 6 years I've been ruling over a kingdom where fathers could sell their daughters without consequence, where men I trusted, men I elevated to positions of power, could commit atrocities and sleep soundly knowing their king was too blind to notice. You couldn't have known. I should have known. The words came out louder than he intended, echoing off the stone walls. That's the entire point of being king, Sienna. I'm supposed to know. I'm supposed to see what's happening in my kingdom, protect the people who can't protect themselves, ensure that power doesn't corrupt the men I give it to. And I failed. Spectacularly, completely, inexcusably failed. Sienna was quiet for a moment, studying him with the careful assessment of someone deciding how much truth he could handle. You're being too hard on yourself. These men were careful. They covered their tracks, used intermediaries, created systems designed specifically to hide what they were doing. Any king would have bothered to learn the names of his servants. Calypso turned to face her, and whatever she saw in his expression made her step back. Any king would have noticed when a council member's daughter vanished for 2 years and then reappeared as a servant. Any king would have created a court where the vulnerable could speak without fear, where loyalty meant honesty rather than silence, where power came with accountability. He moved to the window again, looking down at the courtyard where those nameless, faceless servants continued their work. I built this court, Sienna. I chose these men, rewarded their loyalty, gave them power and influence, and the implicit message that as long as they served me well, I wouldn't look too closely at how they conducted their private affairs. I created the conditions that made Marcus's crimes possible, not intentionally, not maliciously, but through sheer, arrogant blindness. So what are you going to do? Sienna's voice was softer now, the question genuine rather than challenging. I'm going to tear it all down.
He said it simply, a statement of fact rather than bravado. Every structure that enabled this, every law that protected fathers over daughters, every tradition that valued order over justice. I'm going to expose every man involved in this conspiracy, prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law, and then I'm going to rebuild this court from the ground up with people who understand that power is a responsibility, not a privilege. That's going to take years, maybe decades. Then I have decades. He turned back to face her. I'm 34 years old, Sienna. I could rule for another 40 years if I'm careful. I'd rather spend those years building something worth leaving behind than maintaining a kingdom built on the suffering of people I trained myself not to see. Sienna collected her documents and tucked them back into the satchel. As she moved toward the door, she paused with her hand on the latch. For what it's worth, Your Majesty, I think Cordelia was right to trust you with her story. Not many kings would respond to evidence of their own complicity by choosing to burn their entire court to the ground. I'm not doing this for praise or redemption. Calypso's voice was flat, emotionless. I'm doing it because 17 girls deserved a king who would protect them, and they got me instead. The least I can do now is make sure it doesn't happen to 17 more. She left without another word. Calypso remained by the window, watching the sun continue its climb across the sky. Below him, the council waited. Marcus would be there, probably wondering why the king was late, possibly suspecting that something had changed but not yet alarmed enough to run. Let him wonder. Let him sit in that hall surrounded by his co-conspirators and feel the first stirrings of unease. In 24 hours, Calypso would have enough evidence to move against all of them simultaneously. In 24 hours, he would stand before his court and admit his own failures before demanding they answer for theirs. But first, he had one more day of pretending, one more day of sitting across from Marcus and discussing kingdom business, while knowing exactly what kind of monster hid behind that loyal, concerned facade. One more day of being the king he'd been, blind, complicit, wrapped in the comfortable ignorance that came from never having to look too closely at how his power affected the powerless. Tomorrow, he would be different, would force his entire kingdom to be different. Today, he would simply carry the weight of knowing how badly he'd failed, and let that knowledge remake him into something better. Or at least into something that tried.
Chapter 5. Calypso found Marcus in the armory, inspecting a shipment of new swords as though this were any other day, as though the world hadn't already shifted beneath both their feet. The beta looked up when Calypso entered, his expression settling into the practiced mask of loyal concern that had fooled a kingdom for years. "Your Majesty, the council is still waiting." "Let them wait." Calypso closed the door behind him and turned the lock. The soft click echoed in the stone chamber, and something flickered across Marcus's face. Not quite alarm, but a sharpening of attention, a predator recognizing the possibility of threat. "Is something wrong?" Marcus set down the sword he'd been examining, his movements careful, controlled. "If this is about my tardiness with the border reports, I can have them on your desk by—" "This isn't about reports." Calypso moved deeper into the room, putting the work table between them. Distance felt necessary, a buffer against the violence building in his chest. "I'm giving you a chance to tell me the truth, Marcus, about Cordelia, about what you've done to her." The silence stretched long enough for Calypso to hear his own heartbeat, to watch Marcus's face cycle through surprise, confusion, and finally settle on something that might have been amusement if it weren't so cold. "I'm afraid I don't understand what you're asking, Your Majesty." "I think you understand perfectly." Calypso kept his voice level, refusing to give Marcus the satisfaction of seeing how much control it took. "I know about the scars. I know where she's been. I know what you did before you brought her back here 3 years ago." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying Calypso with the same careful assessment he'd given an opponent across a battlefield. Then, slowly, his expression shifted. The mask of loyalty cracked, and beneath it was something far more dangerous. A man who just realized he'd been caught, but hadn't yet decided whether to care. "You told her." It wasn't a question. "I suppose I should have anticipated that. She always was too clever for her own good, too willing to speak when silence would serve her better." The casual acknowledgement hit Calypso like a physical blow. Part of him had still hoped for denial, for some explanation that would make this less monstrous than it appeared. But Marcus stood there confirming it, with the same tone he'd used to discuss the weather, as though his daughter's torture were merely an inconvenient truth rather than an atrocity. "You're not even going to deny it." Calypso's claws extended involuntarily, scraping against the wood of the table between them. "Why would I deny the truth?" Marcus leaned back against the weapons rack, utterly at ease despite the Alpha King's barely contained rage radiating across the room. "You want to know what I did to Cordelia? I disciplined my daughter. I taught her the consequences of disappointing her family. I made use of my property in the way I saw fit, none of which requires your approval or anyone else's." Property. The word tasted like ash in Calypso's mouth. "You're calling your daughter property?" "That's what she is under Dravenmore law, isn't it?" Marcus tilted his head, and there was genuine curiosity in his expression now, as though he were testing how far Calypso had thought this through. "The Paternal Rights Act of 1847. A father has absolute authority over his unmarried daughters until such time as that authority is transferred to a husband. She is mine to guide, to discipline, to dispose of as I see fit. I can marry her off, send her to a convent, put her to work as a servant. The law gives me that power, Your Majesty, your law." Calypso had read that law 100 times, had cited it in judgments when fathers petitioned the crown regarding their daughters' marriages or inheritances. He'd never thought about what it actually meant, what kind of power it granted, what abuses it enabled. The words had seemed reasonable on paper, a man's right to guide his family, to make decisions for those under his protection. But hearing Marcus invoke it now, using it to justify torture and trafficking, Calypso saw the rot that had always been there, hidden behind civilized language and tradition. That law was meant to protect daughters from unwanted marriages, from being forced into situations against their will. Was it? Marcus smiled, and it was the smile of a man who just won an argument. Or was it meant to ensure fathers maintained control over their daughters' futures? Because from where I'm standing, I use that law exactly as it was written. I made decisions about Cordelia's future. I determined how she would serve this family. I exercised my authority. You tortured her. Calypso's voice was low, dangerous. You sold her to a brothel and let men brutalize her for 2 years. I sent her somewhere she could learn discipline and humility. What happened there was between her and her employers. Marcus pushed off from the weapons rack, taking a step closer. But let's say you're right. Let's say I did everything you're accusing me of. Prove it. Bring witnesses who will testify against the beta of Dravenmore, a man who has served this kingdom faithfully for 20 years. Find me a court that will convict a father for disciplining his daughter when the law explicitly gives him that right. The challenge hung in the air between them, and Calypso realized with sickening clarity that Marcus believed he was untouchable. Not because he'd hidden his crimes well, but because he genuinely thought the system would protect him, that the laws Calypso had sworn to uphold would shield a father's authority even when that authority became tyranny. You think you're safe. Calypso studied the man he'd trusted for 15 years, searching for any trace of the loyal advisor he'd thought he knew.
You think because the law is on your side, because you've covered your tracks, because I need you and men like you to run this kingdom, that I won't touch you? I think you're a pragmatist, Your Majesty. Marcus's voice was almost gentle now, as though he were explaining something obvious to a slow student. I think you understand that tearing down your beta over the word of a worthless girl would destabilize your entire court. I think you know that the other council members won't take kindly to seeing one of their own destroyed because he exercised rights every father in this kingdom enjoys. And I think you're smart enough to recognize that some battles aren't worth fighting, especially when you can't win them. Can't win them. Calypso repeated the words slowly, tasting their bitterness. You believe I can't win a battle against a man who tortured his own daughter. I believe you can't afford to fight it. Marcus moved closer still, and his voice dropped to something almost confidential. Listen to me, Calypso. I've served you well. I've won you battles, secured your borders, kept your military running smoothly for 15 years. My personal dealings with my daughter don't change that. They don't affect my ability to serve you. So why destroy something valuable over something that doesn't concern you? The casual dismissal of Cordelia's suffering as something that didn't concern her king made Calypso's vision narrow, made his wolf rise so close to the surface that his bones began to shift. He forced himself back under control through sheer will, refusing to give Marcus the satisfaction of seeing him lose composure. You're right about one thing. Calypso's voice was eerily calm now, the rage compressed into something cold and sharp. This battle will be costly. It will destabilize the court. It will create enemies and chaos and possibly weaken my position. But you're wrong about whether I can afford to fight it. because the alternative is being the kind of king who lets men like you commit atrocities in his name, who values order over justice, who protects the powerful at the expense of the powerless. How noble! Marcus's smile was back, mocking now. And when your council rebels, when your nobles decide you've become a tyrant who destroys loyal men on the word of servants, when your enemies see weakness and opportunity in the chaos you create, will your nobility comfort you then? I don't know. Calypso met Marcus's eyes steadily. But I know I won't spend the next 40 years wondering how many daughters suffered because I was too much of a coward to act. I know I won't build a kingdom on the broken bodies of girls like Cordelia while pretending I'm a just and honorable king. For the first time, something like unease crossed Marcus's face. Not fear exactly, but a recalibration, a recognition that the man standing before him had changed in fundamental ways that made past certainties unreliable. You're making a mistake. The words carried less confidence now. Less of that casual certainty. You'll regret this. I already have more regrets than you can imagine. Calypso moved toward the door, unlocking it with hands that trembled slightly from the effort of not shifting, not tearing into the man who stood there defending the indefensible. But adding you to the list won't be one of them. You have until tomorrow morning to prepare whatever defense you think the law will give you. Then you'll answer for what you've done, and we'll see if the system you're counting on to protect you is really as broken as you believe. He left before Marcus could respond, before the last threads of his control could snap. Behind him, he heard nothing, no footsteps fleeing, no sounds of panic, just silence and the quiet confidence of a man who still believed he was untouchable. Tomorrow, Calypso would prove him wrong. Tonight, he would carry the weight of knowing he'd spent 15 years ruling beside a monster and calling him friend. Chapter 6. The council chamber felt different at midnight. During the day, it was a place of orderly debate, of measured voices discussing tariffs and treaties and the mundane machinery of governance. But now, with only moonlight streaming through the high windows and Sienna spreading documents across the ancient oak table, it felt like what it actually was, a place where men had gathered for years to discuss how best to exploit the kingdom they pretended to serve. Calypso stood at the head of the table, watching Sienna arrange evidence into careful piles. Each stack represented a different council member, a different betrayal. She worked in silence, her movements precise and methodical, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her jaw tightened every time she read another transaction, another coded entry that translated to another girl sold. Lord Petros was the first to join Marcus. Sienna placed a ledger in front of Calypso, her finger tracing a line of numbers. 6 years ago, just after Marcus established Thornwood Imports, Petros's daughter Elena vanished around the same time, officially sent to care for a sick aunt in the eastern provinces. The aunt doesn't exist, I checked. Calypso stared at the numbers, at the neat columns that documented the sale of a man's daughter with the same clinical precision used to record grain shipments. Elena was 16 when she disappeared? 15. Sienna's correction was quiet but firm. Her birthday is in autumn. She just turned 15 when Petros signed her over to Silas. 15. The same age as some of the soldiers who trained in his yards, who he'd personally forbidden from seeing combat because they were too young, too unformed, still practically children. And Petros had sold his daughter at that age, had taken money in exchange for condemning her to 2 years in a brothel, and then sat in council meetings discussing the moral character of foreign ambassadors. Who else? Calypso's voice sounded hollow even to himself.
Lord Hadrian. His daughter Mira was 17 when she vanished 3 years ago. The official story was that she'd run away with a merchant's son. Hadrian even made a public show of disowning her, cutting her off from the family completely. Sienna pulled out another ledger, this one covered in Hadrian's distinctive sloping handwriting. The truth is, he sold her to cover gambling debts that would have bankrupted him. Silas gave him enough to settle with his creditors and stay on the council. Calypso remembered that incident, remembered Hadrian's carefully crafted grief, his speeches about rebellious daughters, and the pain of having his generosity thrown back in his face. The entire court had sympathized with him. Calypso himself had offered quiet words of support, had told Hadrian that sometimes children made choices their parents couldn't control, that he shouldn't blame himself for his daughter's recklessness. And all the while, Mira had been locked in a brothel, servicing men who paid Silas for access to the disgraced nobleman's daughter. All the while, Hadrian had been counting his money and accepting sympathy for a betrayal he'd invented to cover his own crimes. "There's more." Sienna's voice pulled him back. "Counselor Brennan, his daughter Joanna was 18, already engaged to a merchant's son from a good family. Then Brennan's investments collapsed. He'd put everything into a shipping venture that went down in a storm. He couldn't afford the dowry he'd promised, couldn't face the humiliation of admitting his financial ruin. So he sold her instead." Calypso didn't need to hear the rest. The pattern was clear now, repetitive and nauseating in its consistency. He told the merchant's family that Joanna had developed a wasting sickness, that she died suddenly in the night. He even held a funeral. There's a gravestone in the family plot with her name on it. Sienna's hands were shaking slightly as she pulled out the next document. Meanwhile, Joanna spent 18 months in Silas's establishment before a wealthy merchant from the south bought her contract. According to the records, she's still alive, still owned by the man who purchased her like livestock. Calypso sat down heavily, the weight of each revelation pressing him into the chair. 4 council members, 4 men he'd trusted with the governance of his kingdom, who he'd elevated to positions of power and influence, who he'd consulted on matters of justice and law and the proper ordering of society. 4 men who'd sold their own daughters and then returned to court to debate moral philosophy and civic virtue. The Council of Elders. The realization hit him with sickening clarity. These men don't just sit on my administrative council. Petros and Hadrian both serve on the Council of Elders. The Council of Elders was supposed to be the moral center of Dravenmoor's government, the body that advised the king on matters of tradition and law, that preserved the kingdom's ancient customs and ensured continuity across generations. Membership was considered the highest honor a nobleman could achieve, reserved for men of exceptional character and unwavering integrity. And Calypso had appointed 2 men who trafficked their own daughters. "There's precedent for this." Sienna's voice was carefully neutral, the tone she used when delivering news she knew would devastate. "I found references in the older ledgers, transactions dating back 8 years. Before Marcus, before Thornwood Imports, there was another network, smaller, less organized, but operating on the same principles. Who ran it? Calypso already knew he wouldn't like the answer. Lord Cassius. Sienna met his eyes. Your father's beta. He died 6 years ago, right around the time Marcus started Thornwood Imports. The room tilted. Lord Cassius had been like an uncle to Calypso, had served his father faithfully for 30 years, had been one of the few men the old king trusted completely. When Cassius died, the entire kingdom had mourned. Calypso himself had delivered the eulogy, had spoken of Cassius's loyalty and wisdom and dedication to Dravenmoor's prosperity. My father knew. The words came out flat, emotionless, because feeling the full weight of that betrayal would break something fundamental inside him. "I don't know what your father knew." Sienna's response was careful, precise. But Cassius was careful. He kept everything hidden, used intermediaries, never put his own name on any documents. If your father suspected something, if he ever investigated, there's no record of it. Which meant either his father had been as blind as Calypso, or he'd known and looked the other way. Both possibilities were unbearable in different ways. Either the man Calypso had idolized, had tried to emulate for 15 years of rule, had been a fool who couldn't see the corruption festering in his own court, or he'd been complicit in it, had valued order and stability over the lives of the daughters his beta sold. How far does this go? Calypso forced himself to focus on the present crisis, on the conspiracy he could still stop, even if he couldn't change the past. If Cassius ran this network for years, if Marcus took it over and expanded it, if 4 of my current council members are involved, how many others know? How many others profit? I found evidence of at least 6 other men who facilitated transactions, lower-level officials, merchants with connections, a magistrate who falsified records. Sienna pulled out another stack of documents. They didn't sell their own daughters, but they helped process the sales, provided cover stories, created the legal paperwork that made girls disappear without questions. Some took bribes, others received favors, positions in the court, lucrative contracts, advancement for their sons. A web of corruption stretching across his entire government, not just a few corrupt individuals, but a system, an infrastructure built over years to facilitate the trafficking of noblemen's daughters. And all of it hidden behind legitimate business dealings, respectable titles, the veneer of honor that came with serving the crown. The investment circle. Calypso remembered Sienna mentioning it yesterday. That's what they call themselves? They meet the first Tuesday of every month in a private room above the Silver Stag Tavern. The owner thinks they're discussing timber investments and trade opportunities. He has no idea they're actually negotiating the sale price of their daughters. Sienna laid out a calendar marked with dates and notations. The last meeting was a week ago. According to Marcus's notes, they discussed 3 new opportunities, 3 more daughters they're planning to sell. 3 more girls, 3 more families about to be destroyed by fathers who saw their daughters as nothing more than assets to liquidate. 3 more Cordelias who would disappear into Silas's network while their fathers returned home to collect sympathy and condolences. Unless Calypso stopped it. Unless he was willing to tear apart his entire government, prosecute members of the Council of Elders, expose corruption that reached back into his father's reign. Unless he was willing to admit that the kingdom he'd inherited, the system he'd been so proud to maintain, was rotten at its foundation. I need a list. He stood, needing to move, needing to do something with the rage and horror churning in his chest. Every man involved, every transaction, every girl. I need documentation that will hold up in a public trial, evidence so overwhelming that no one can claim this is a political persecution or an attack on noble privilege. You'll have it by morning, Sienna began gathering the documents. But Your Majesty, you need to understand what you're about to do. If you move against the Council of Elders, if you expose corruption in your father's court, you're not just destabilizing your own government, you're attacking the foundation of Dravenmore's power structure. The noble families won't forgive this. They'll see it as proof that no one is safe, that ancient privilege means nothing, that you're willing to destroy tradition itself. Good. Calypso's voice was cold, final, because that's exactly what I'm willing to do. If tradition means fathers can sell daughters, if ancient privilege means immunity from justice, if the foundation of our power structure is built on the broken bodies of girls no one bothered to protect, then it all needs to burn. He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the latch. The 3 new opportunities Marcus mentioned. Do you have names? Sienna consulted her notes, her expression grim. Lord Reeves' daughter Catherine just turned 16, Councillor Thorne's daughter Beatrice, 17, and Baron Aldrich's daughter Sophia, 14. 14, the same age Cordelia had been when Marcus first sold her. Send word to have those families watched. Calypso kept his voice steady through sheer force of will. If any of those girls go missing, if there's any attempt to move them before I can act, I want to know immediately. Already done, Sienna met his eyes. I assigned your most trusted guards to monitor all 3 households, discreetly, so the fathers won't suspect, but they're being watched. Good. He opened the door, then looked back at the evidence spread across the council table, at the careful documentation of years of systematic abuse. Tomorrow, this ends. Tomorrow, every man who thought he was untouchable learns what justice looks like when a king finally decides to see. He left Sienna to finish cataloging the evidence of his kingdom's corruption. Behind him, the empty council chamber waited for morning, for the moment when Calypso would stand before the men who'd betrayed everything he thought his kingdom represented and force them to answer for it. His father's beta had built this network. His own beta had expanded it. The Council of Elders had participated in it. And Calypso had ruled over it all, blind and arrogant and convinced that his careful attention to border disputes and trade agreements made him a good king. Tomorrow, he would stop being that king. Tomorrow, he would become something else, something harder, more ruthless, willing to burn his entire court to the ground if that's what justice required. Tonight, he would simply carry the knowledge of how deep the rot went and let it fuel the fire he was about to set.
Chapter 7. The Great Hall had never held so many people. Every noble family in Dravenmoor had sent representatives, every guildmaster and merchant of significance, every ranking military officer. They packed the galleries and lined the walls, their faces showing everything from curiosity to outrage to the carefully blank expressions of people who'd already chosen sides but weren't ready to reveal their allegiances. Calypso sat on the throne at the head of the hall, robes of state weighing heavy on his shoulders, the crown he rarely wore pressing against his temples like an accusation. Below him, arranged in a semicircle, sat the 7 justices he'd summoned from across the kingdom, men and women known for their integrity, their independence, their unwillingness to be swayed by political pressure. He'd chosen them specifically because none owed their positions to Marcus or the other accused, because they'd spent their careers in provincial courts far from the corruption of the capital. And in the center of the hall, standing alone on the accused platform, was Marcus. 3 other council members stood on platforms beside him, Petros, Hadrian, Brennan, but somehow Marcus dominated the space. His posture relaxed, almost bored, as though this entire proceeding were beneath his notice. The galleries murmured with speculation. No one knew exactly why the tribunal had been called, only that the king himself had ordered it, that 4 members of his council stood accused of crimes unspecified, that this was unprecedented in the modern history of Dravenmoor. Calypso let the speculation build for another moment, then rose. The hall fell silent. This tribunal has been called to address crimes against the crown and kingdom. His voice carried to the furthest corners, amplified by the stone and his own alpha presence. Crimes of trafficking, of corruption, of the systematic abuse of power for personal profit. The accused will hear the charges against them, witnesses will testify, and justice will be rendered according to the laws of Dravenmoor. He nodded to Sienna, who stood at the prosecutor's table with documents stacked in careful piles. She rose, her voice clear and steady as she began reading from the formal charges. Each accusation was documented, dated, linked to specific transactions from the ledgers she'd recovered. The sale of daughters to a known trafficker, the use of shell companies to disguise profits, the falsification of death certificates and travel documents, the conspiracy to exploit noble privilege for criminal enterprise. The hall erupted. Nobles shouted denials and accusations, demanded proof, called this a political purge. The justices called for order, their voices drowned in the chaos, until Calypso stood again, and the sheer force of his alpha command silenced the room. "The evidence will be presented in full." He kept his voice level, implacable. "But first, the court will hear testimony from those who suffered at the hands of the accused. The court calls Cordelia, daughter of Marcus, to testify." The doors at the rear of the hall opened. Cordelia walked through them with her head high, her back straight, despite the weight of hundreds of eyes turning to assess her. She wore a simple gray dress. Calypso had offered her court attire, but she'd refused, said she wouldn't pretend to be something she wasn't. The scars on her exposed arms were visible to everyone, pale lines against tanned skin, a map of suffering she'd stopped trying to hide. She crossed the hall in absolute silence, her footsteps the only sound in that vast space. When she reached the witness platform, she climbed the steps without hesitation and turned to face her father. Marcus smiled at her. It was a small thing, barely perceptible to anyone who wasn't watching closely, but Calypso saw it. Saw the cruel amusement in his beta's eyes, the absolute certainty that whatever Cordelia said, whatever she revealed, it wouldn't matter. "State your name for the court." The Chief Justice's voice was gentle, carefully neutral. "Cordelia, daughter of Marcus, formerly of House Thane." Her voice didn't shake. "Currently a servant in the royal household. Do you swear to tell the truth in this proceeding, understanding that false testimony before this tribunal carries a sentence of imprisonment?" "I swear it." The Chief Justice nodded to Sienna, who approached the witness platform with a document in hand. "Cordelia, can you tell the court where you were between the ages of 14 and 16? "I was in a brothel called the Velvet Rose, owned by a man named Silas." She said it simply, without drama or emotion, as though reciting a fact no more significant than her birth date. "My father sold me there when I was 14. I remained there for 2 years, until my father bought me back and brought me to the palace as a servant." The hall exploded again. This time the justices didn't bother calling for order, just let the chaos burn itself out while Cordelia stood there, unflinching, waiting for silence. Marcus's smile never wavered. When the noise finally subsided, Sienna continued, "Can you describe the conditions at the Velvet Rose?" Cordelia's jaw tightened, the first sign of the effort this was costing her. "Men paid Silas for access to the girls he kept there. We were not permitted to refuse clients or request different treatment. Discipline for disobedience was severe. I have scars across my back from whippings, burns on my ribs from heated irons, marks on my wrists and ankles from restraints. I was 14 when I arrived. Most of the other girls were between 13 and 17. A woman in the gallery made a sound like a wounded animal. Others wept openly, but many faces remained closed, calculating, waiting to see how this played out before committing to a response. "And your father," Sienna gestured to Marcus, "he was aware of these conditions?" Cordelia's eyes never left her father's face. "He visited me 3 times during those 2 years, once to check that I was still profitable, once to renegotiate his percentage of my earnings, once to inform me that he would be retrieving me soon because he needed a servant he didn't have to pay." Marcus rose smoothly, his voice cutting across the hall before Sienna could ask another question. "I invoke the right of silence." The words fell like stones into still water. The justices straightened in their seats. The galleries went absolutely silent. Even Cordelia paled, though she didn't step back, didn't show fear. "The right of silence," Marcus continued, his voice carrying the weight of ancient authority.
as codified in the Family Honor Preservation Act of 1689. No child may bring public accusation against their parent in any court of law. To do so is to violate the sacred bond of family, to betray the honor of one's house, to commit treason against the natural order that binds our society together. He turned to face the justices directly. My daughter is engaging in exactly this prohibited behavior. She stands before this court, before the entire assembled nobility of Dravenmore, and makes public accusation against her father. By the letter of the law, this alone is sufficient grounds for her exile from the kingdom. By historical precedent, it has been cause for execution. Calypso's claws dug into the arms of his throne, gouging deep grooves in the ancient wood. He'd known Marcus would invoke the right of silence. Sienna had warned him, had shown him the statute, had explained that this was the final protection built into the system to ensure fathers remained untouchable. But hearing it spoken aloud, hearing Marcus use a law meant to preserve family unity as a weapon to silence his daughter's testimony about her own torture, made Calypso's vision narrow with rage. The Chief Justice looked to Calypso, her expression carefully blank. Your Majesty, the accused has invoked a valid legal protection. The court must rule on whether the witness's testimony is permissible before proceeding. This was the moment. This was where Calypso could lose everything, expose the corruption in his court, only to have it protected by the very laws he'd sworn to uphold, where he could watch Marcus walk free because the system valued a father's honor over a daughter's suffering, where justice would die beneath the weight of tradition and precedent and comfortable assumptions about the natural order of things. Calypso stood. The hall held its breath. The right of silence, he said slowly, was enacted in 1689 to prevent false accusations motivated by inheritance disputes or family feuds. It was meant to protect fathers from malicious slander, to preserve the bonds of trust and respect that should exist between parent and child. Marcus's smile grew wider. He thought he'd won. But the law itself contains an exception. Calypso's voice hardened. Section 4, subsection C, the right of silence shall not apply in cases where the parent stands accused of crimes against the crown or kingdom, where the testimony regards matters of public safety or national interest, or where the accusation involves actions that constitute treason, murder, or trafficking in human persons. He let that sink in, watched Marcus's smile finally falter. Trafficking in human persons, the very crime my beta stands accused of, the crime that supersedes his right of silence, that makes his daughter's testimony not only permissible but legally required. Calypso turned to the justices. The court will rule on this matter, but I submit that the exception applies, that Cordelia's testimony is not a violation of family honor, but a fulfillment of her duty to the kingdom, that the law Marcus seeks to hide behind was never meant to protect fathers who sell their daughters. The Chief Justice conferred quietly with her fellow justices. The gallery waited in absolute silence. Cordelia stood on her platform, still facing her father, still refusing to look away. Finally, the Chief Justice spoke. The court finds that the exception applies. The right of silence does not protect the accused in this matter. The witness may continue her testimony. Marcus's face went dark with rage. For the first time, his composure cracked, revealing the monster beneath. You're making a mistake, Your Majesty. You're tearing apart laws that have preserved this kingdom for centuries. You're empowering children to destroy their parents, servants to accuse their masters, chaos to replace order. And for what? For her?
He gestured dismissively at Cordelia. "For a worthless girl who should be grateful I didn't leave her to die in whatever gutter spawned her?" "That worthless girl," Calypso said quietly, "is worth more than every man standing on those platforms combined. And the laws you're defending, the order you're trying to preserve, if they require her silence to survive, then they deserve to burn." He nodded to Sienna. "Continue the examination." Cordelia took a breath and began to speak again. This time when she described her father's crimes, when she detailed the scars and the suffering and the systematic destruction of her childhood, no one tried to stop her. Marcus stood in silent fury, his invincible armor of law and tradition finally stripped away, forced to listen while his daughter told the truth he'd tried so hard to bury. And in the galleries, Calypso watched the faces of Dravenmore's nobility as they heard what had been done in their name, under their laws, with their complicit silence. Some wept, some turned away in shame, but many watched with expressions of calculation, already deciding how this would affect their own positions, their own power, their own daughters. The trial had only begun, but the kingdom Calypso had inherited, the comfortable order he'd maintained for 15 years, was already burning. He'd promised to tear it all down. Now he was keeping that promise, one damning testimony at a time. Chapter 8. Cordelia's voice never wavered as she continued her testimony, but Calypso could see the cost in the white-knuckled grip she maintained on the platform's railing, in the rigid set of her shoulders, in the way she had to pause sometimes to breathe through memories that wanted to drag her under. The first night at the Velvet Rose, Silas had me brought to a room on the 3rd floor. He explained the rules. Obedience was rewarded with adequate food and a pallet to sleep on. Disobedience was punished immediately and severely. Refusal to serve clients meant 3 days locked in the basement without food or water. Attempted escape meant public whipping in the courtyard so the other girls could watch and learn. She pulled up her left sleeve, revealing a circular scar on her shoulder. "This is from the first week. A client wanted me to call him father while he—" She stopped, swallowed hard. I refused. Silas held a heated brand to my shoulder for 10 seconds. He told me that my preferences didn't matter anymore, that my father had sold all rights to my body and my voice, and if I wanted to survive, I needed to understand that I was property now. The hall was absolutely silent. Even the nobles who'd been calculating political advantage looked sick now, confronted with the visceral reality of what trafficking actually meant. "Turn around," Sienna said quietly. "Show them your back." Cordelia hesitated for the first time, her hand trembling as she reached for the laces of her dress. Then she lifted her chin and began unlacing. The fabric fell away from her shoulders, pooling at her waist, leaving her back exposed to the packed hall. A woman in the gallery sobbed. A man cursed. The justices sat frozen, their professional detachment shattered by the evidence written in scar tissue across a girl's spine. Calypso had seen her back before, but somehow it was worse in the harsh morning light streaming through the high windows, worse with hundreds of witnesses forced to confront what they'd preferred to ignore. The scars formed layers, old ones white and faded, newer ones still pink and raised, some cutting across others in a crisscross pattern that mapped years of systematic torture. There were whip marks and burn scars and places where the skin had healed wrong, puckered and tight from wounds that had never received proper treatment. 37 times, Cordelia said, her voice steady despite her nakedness, despite the exposure of everything she'd survived.
37 times I was whipped in the 2 years I spent at the Velvet Rose, sometimes for disobedience, sometimes because clients paid extra to watch, sometimes because Silas was in a mood and needed to remind us all what happened to girls who forgot their place. She turned to face the hall again, leaving her dress where it fell. I learned their names eventually, the men who paid to hurt me. I learned to recognize their voices, their footsteps, the particular ways they liked to cause pain. There was a merchant who wanted me to beg him to stop, a magistrate who paid double to leave marks where they wouldn't show, a noble from the western provinces who liked to— Enough! Marcus's voice cracked across the hall like a whip. This is obscene. This is a public degradation of a father by his own daughter, a violation of every law and custom that governs family relations. Your Majesty, I once again invoke the right of silence. This testimony is prohibited under— The court has already ruled on your invocation. The Chief Justice's voice was ice. The exception applies. The witness will continue. Then I appeal to the king directly. Marcus turned to face Calypso, and there was desperation in his eyes now, the first real fear Calypso had seen since this trial began. Your Majesty, you sit there and allow my daughter to shame me publicly, to destroy my honor and my house with accusations that should never be spoken aloud. The right of silence exists for exactly this reason, to prevent this kind of public humiliation, to preserve the dignity of families, to protect the natural hierarchy that keeps our society functioning. He gestured at the galleries, at the assembled nobles watching in horrified silence. Look at them. Look at what you're teaching them. That children can destroy their parents, that servants can accuse their masters, that the lowest can drag down the highest with nothing more than words and scars that could have come from anywhere. You're creating chaos, Your Majesty. You're tearing down the foundations of everything our kingdom is built on. Calypso stood slowly, feeling the weight of the crown on his head, the weight of every eye in the hall turning to him, waiting to see which he valued more, order or justice, tradition or truth, the comfortable hierarchy Marcus defended, or the girl standing half-naked on the witness platform with her torture scars on display. You're right about one thing, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast hall. I am tearing down foundations. I am creating chaos. I am teaching the assembled nobility of Dravenmoor that the old order, the natural hierarchy, the comfortable traditions we've relied on for centuries, all of it can and should be destroyed if it protects monsters over victims. He descended from the throne, moving to stand at the front of the platform, where everyone could see him clearly. The right of silence was enacted in 1689. For 337 years it has stood as law in this kingdom. For 337 years it has protected fathers from their children's accusations. And in all that time, how many Cordelias suffered in silence because they knew the law would punish them for speaking? How many girls were sold, beaten, tortured, destroyed, all while the law made sure no one ever had to hear about it? He turned to face Marcus directly. You invoke this law like it's sacred, like its age makes it righteous. But longevity doesn't equal justice. A law that stood for 3 centuries can still be fundamentally wrong. And this law, this protection you're hiding behind, is wrong. It was wrong when it was written, wrong every day it remained on the books, and wrong now as you try to use it to silence your daughter's testimony about the crimes you committed against her. Marcus's face had gone white. Your Majesty, you cannot simply abolish a law because it's inconvenient to your political agenda. I'm not abolishing it because it's inconvenient. Calypso's voice was hard, implacable. I'm abolishing it because it's evil, because it protects the powerful at the expense of the powerless, because it values a father's honor over a daughter's survival, because it has no place in a kingdom that claims to value justice. He turned to the justices. As Alpha King of Dravenmore, under the emergency powers granted to the Crown in matters of immediate moral necessity, I hereby abolish the right of silence as codified in the Family Honor Preservation Act of 1689. Effective immediately, no person will be prevented from testifying about crimes committed against them on the basis of family relationship. No law will protect parents who abuse their children, masters who torture their servants, or powerful men who believe their status exempts them from accountability. The hall erupted. Nobles shouted protests and accusations, demanded votes and procedures, called this tyranny and overreach. But Calypso didn't sit back down, didn't try to calm the chaos. He stood there and let them rage, let them exhaust themselves against the simple fact that the law they'd relied on to maintain their control was gone. When the noise finally died down, Calypso spoke again. I know what you're thinking, that I'm a tyrant, that I'm destroying the rule of law, that tomorrow I might abolish other statutes that inconvenient me. But ask yourselves this. Which of you would stand before this court and argue that the right of silence should remain? Which of you wants to look at Cordelia, at her scars, at the evidence of what she survived, and say that the law should have prevented her from speaking? Which of you truly believes that protecting a father's honor is more important than protecting a daughter's life? The silence that followed was absolute. No one spoke. No one defended the law Calypso had just abolished. They might rage about the method, might fear the precedent, might worry about their own power and privilege, but not one of them was willing to publicly argue that Cordelia should have been silenced. The right of silence is abolished, Calypso said quietly, and if there are other laws like it, other statutes that protect abusers, other traditions that value order over justice, other comfortable assumptions that require someone's suffering to maintain, they will be abolished too, one by one if necessary, because I will not spend the next 40 years ruling over a kingdom where laws designed to protect victims instead protect the men who hurt them.
He turned back to Cordelia, who still stood on the platform with her dress around her waist, her scars visible to everyone. Finish your testimony, all of it, every scar, every crime, every name. The court will hear you, and the law will not silence you again. Cordelia took a shaking breath, and something in her face changed, the careful blankness she'd maintained cracking to reveal grief and rage and a terrible, fragile hope. She pulled her dress back up over her shoulders, but didn't lace it completely, left her arms exposed so the scars remained visible. The magistrate's name was Corvin, she said, her voice stronger now. He served on the provincial court in the Eastern District. He visited the Velvet Rose twice a month for 18 months. He liked to use his belt, liked to leave marks across my ribs where they wouldn't show if I wore a high-necked dress. He told me he had daughters at home, told me he'd never touched them but needed somewhere to express his urges, somewhere safe where it didn't matter. She continued naming names, detailing crimes, describing the men who'd paid Silas for access to girls whose fathers had sold them, a merchant who'd served on trade committees, a military officer who'd won honors for valor, a scholar who'd published treatises on moral philosophy,
respectable men, honored men, men whose positions in society made them untouchable. Until now. With every name Cordelia spoke, Calypso watched faces in the gallery change, some with horror, some with shame, some with dawning realization that the men they'd trusted, worked with, respected, were part of this. That the corruption wasn't isolated to Marcus and his co-conspirators, but spread through their entire society like rot through timber. When Cordelia finally finished, when she'd named every man she could remember and described every scar she carried, she looked directly at her father. "You sold me when I was 14. You told me I was worthless, that I should be grateful you'd found a use for me, that this was all I deserved. You collected money for my suffering, you profited from my torture, and you did it all while serving as beta to a kingdom that trusted you, that believed you were a man of honor." She turned to face Calypso. "Your Majesty asked me to trust him with my story. I did. He asked me to stand here and tell the truth, even though every law and tradition said I should stay silent. I have. Now I'm asking the court, asking this kingdom to decide whether my father's honor matters more than my survival, whether the comfortable order he's defending is worth preserving if it required my silence." Calypso met her eyes, saw the cost of everything she'd just done written in the trembling of her hands, in the tears she was fighting not to shed. "The court has heard your testimony, and your silence is no longer required. No law will protect the men who hurt you. No tradition will excuse what they've done. You have my word as king." He turned to Marcus, to the other council members on their platforms, to the galleries full of nobles who'd maintained the system that made this possible. "And everyone in this hall should understand, the old order is dead. The laws that protected monsters over victims are gone. The comfortable assumptions that let good men look the other way while girls suffered are finished. We are building something different now, something better, even if we have to burn everything else to the ground to do it." Marcus stared at him with naked hatred, all pretense of loyalty finally stripped away. The other accused stood in stunned silence, and in the galleries, Dravenmoor's nobility began to understand that their king had meant every word he'd said. The trial would continue. Evidence would be presented, verdicts rendered, sentences passed. But the real judgment had already happened, not on Marcus alone, but on the entire kingdom that had enabled him. And Calypso would spend the rest of his reign ensuring they never forgot it. Chapter 9. The verdict came on the third day of testimony, after Sienna had presented ledgers and bank records and coded correspondence that left no room for doubt. After 3 more daughters had taken the witness stand to describe their own ordeals, after the justices had heard testimony from Silas himself, brought in chains from a prison cell where he'd been found trying to burn evidence of his transactions. Guilty on all counts, all 4 council members, Marcus, Petros, Hadrian, Brennan, guilty of trafficking, of conspiracy, of abuse of power, of crimes against the kingdom and against their own daughters. The hall waited for Calypso to pronounce sentence. Traditional punishment for trafficking was execution, a public hanging meant to send a message about the kingdom's intolerance for such crimes. The galleries expected blood, wanted the spectacle of powerful men brought low, wanted to watch Marcus swing from a rope as payment for every girl he'd sold. Calypso stood before the assembled court and gave them something else. Marcus, son of Thane, former beta of Dravenmoor. His voice was steady, emotionless. You are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment with hard labor. You will be stripped of your title, your lands, your wealth. Everything you own will be liquidated and distributed as restitution to your victims. You will spend the remainder of your days breaking rocks in the northern quarries, performing the same back-breaking labor as the low-born men you despised, living in the same conditions as the daughters you sold. And you will do it knowing that every person in this kingdom knows exactly what you are, a man who tortured his own child for profit, a monster who hid behind laws and tradition and the comfortable assumption that power exempted him from consequences. Marcus's face had gone gray. Death would have been mercy, would have been an ending. This was something else. Years, possibly decades of waking every morning to shame and hard labor and the absolute knowledge that he'd lost everything. You wanted me to prove you could be touched. You believed the system would protect you, that your position and my need for stability would keep you safe. You were wrong, and you will spend the rest of your life being reminded of exactly how wrong you were. He turned to the other 3 council members. Petros, Hadrian, Brennan, the same sentence applies to you. Life imprisonment, hard labor, total forfeiture of assets. You sold your daughters. You profited from their suffering. You betrayed every principle you claimed to uphold. And now you will face the consequences of those choices every day until you die. The justices recorded the sentences. The guards moved forward to take the condemned into custody. Marcus didn't struggle, didn't protest, just stared at Calypso with hollow eyes as chains were fastened around his wrists. In that moment, Calypso saw not the confident Beta who challenged him in the armory, but a broken man who'd finally understood that his armor of law and privilege had been stripped away, leaving him exposed to the justice he'd never thought would reach him.
"Take them to the quarries," Calypso said. "Let them begin their sentences immediately." He watched the guards lead them away. 4 men who'd sat on his council, who he trusted with the governance of his kingdom, who'd betrayed everything they pretended to be. The hall remained silent as they disappeared through the rear doors, as the comfortable order they'd represented crumbled into memory. When they were gone, Calypso turned back to the assembled nobility. "This trial is concluded, but the work of reform has only begun. The laws that enabled these crimes, the traditions that protected abusers, the comfortable assumptions that let good people ignore suffering, all of it ends now." He gestured to Sienna, who brought forward a leather-bound document stamped with the royal seal. "I present to this court the Cordelia Accords, a comprehensive reform of Dravenmore's laws regarding the treatment of servants, the rights of daughters, and the prosecution of trafficking crimes. Named for the woman whose courage exposed the rot in our kingdom, these laws will ensure that no one else suffers as she did, that power comes with accountability, that the vulnerable have protection under the law." He began reading, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. First, the complete abolition of any statute that prevents victims from testifying about crimes committed against them, regardless of relationship to the accused. Second, the criminalization of all forms of human trafficking, with mandatory life sentences and no possibility of pardon. Third, the establishment of legal protections for servants, the right to fair wages, safe working conditions, freedom from physical punishment, and the ability to bring grievances directly to the crown without fear of retaliation. The nobility shifted uncomfortably.
These weren't minor adjustments to existing law. These were fundamental changes to how power functioned in Dravenmoor, to the relationship between master and servant, father and daughter, the powerful and the powerless. Fourth, Calypso continued, the creation of a royal commission to investigate all historical cases of trafficking, with full authority to prosecute anyone involved, regardless of their current position or status. The men who bought access to Cordelia and the other girls, the magistrates and merchants and officers she named in her testimony, will be found and charged. The network that enabled these crimes will be dismantled completely. He set down the document and looked out at the assembled faces. I know what you're thinking, that these reforms go too far, that they destabilize the natural order, that they give too much power to those who should know their place. But I have spent 3 days listening to testimony about what happens when we prioritize order over justice, when we value tradition over truth, when we assume that the way things have always been is the way things should remain. I will not build my reign on that foundation.
He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. The Cordelia Accords take effect immediately. Any nobleman who believes his authority is more important than his daughter's safety, any master who thinks his servants exist only to be used, any man who assumes his power exempts him from accountability, you are welcome to test these new laws, but understand that the consequences will be severe, public, and permanent. The session ended. The nobles filed out in silence, some with faces set in anger, others with expressions of calculation as they adjusted to the new reality. Calypso remained on the throne until the hall was empty except for Sienna and the justices collecting their documents. He found Cordelia in the gardens 3 hours later, sitting on a stone bench beneath an oak tree, staring at nothing. She'd changed out of the gray dress she'd worn to testify, was wearing servant's clothes again, rough linen and worn leather, the uniform of invisibility she'd lived in for 3 years. "You don't have to wear those anymore," Calypso said quietly, approaching slowly so as not to startle her. "You're not a servant. You're the woman who saved this kingdom from its own corruption. You can wear whatever you want." "These are comfortable." She didn't look at him. "And familiar. Everything else feels like a costume." He sat on the bench beside her, leaving space between them, acutely aware that his presence might feel like command, like pressure, like everything he was trying not to be. "Your testimony changed everything. The Cordelia Accords, the reforms, the trials, none of it happens without your courage. My testimony got my father sent to a quarry for the rest of his life." Her voice was flat, emotionless. "I stood in front of the entire kingdom and described every scar, every client, every moment of torture. I exposed myself completely, and now I don't know who I'm supposed to be. Not a servant, not a victim, not a daughter anymore. Just Cordelia, whoever that is." "You're the woman who survived." Calypso chose his words carefully, aware that everything between them was fragile, new, undefined. "The woman who refused to stay silent, the woman who trusted me with truth I didn't deserve to hear, and then stood witness while I burned down a kingdom to honor that truth." She finally looked at him, and her eyes were haunted. "You abolished a 300-year-old law in the middle of a trial. You sentenced 4 council members to life imprisonment. You passed reforms that will make you enemies throughout the nobility. You did all of it because I told you what my father did to me. That's a terrible burden to carry, knowing that my words caused that much destruction." "Your words didn't cause destruction, they revealed it." He held her gaze, needing her to understand this. The corruption was always there. The rot was always spreading. The system was always broken. You just forced me to finally see it, to stop being comfortable in my ignorance, to choose justice over the easy path of looking away." Cordelia was quiet for a long moment, studying his face as though trying to decide whether to believe him. "What happens now? You've remade your kingdom, passed your laws, punished the guilty. What happens to me?" This was the question Calypso had been both hoping for and dreading. He'd rehearsed speeches, prepared elegant arguments, planned out exactly what to say. But sitting here beside her in the garden, with the weight of everything they'd survived hanging between them, all the prepared words felt wrong. "I want to ask you something," he said slowly, "not as a king commanding, but as a man hoping. I want you to stand beside me, not as a subject, not as a symbol of reform, not as proof that the new laws work, but as an equal, as someone who sees what I can't, who will tell me truths I don't want to hear, who will keep me honest when power makes me comfortable again." He turned to face her fully. "I need someone who remembers what it's like to be invisible, who understands what happens in the shadows I trained myself not to see. I need someone who won't let me forget that being king means protecting the powerless, not just managing the powerful. I need you, Cordelia, not because you're useful or symbolic or politically convenient, because you're the only person in this kingdom who can look at me and see both the man I am and the king I'm trying to become." Cordelia studied him with those dark eyes that had seen too much, survived too much, understood too much about the distance between words and actions. "You're asking me to be your conscience." "I'm asking you to be my partner." He said it simply, truthfully. "In reforming this kingdom, in building something better, in making sure the Cordelia Accords aren't just words on paper, but lived reality. I'm asking you to stand beside me and keep me from ever becoming the kind of king who stops seeing his servants, who values order over justice, who lets comfort blind him to suffering." She was quiet for so long that Calypso thought she might refuse, might stand up and walk away from everything he was offering, because the burden was too great, the risk too high, the cost of standing beside a king who'd failed her for 3 years too steep. Then she spoke, her voice steady and clear. "Yes, but only if you promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll keep seeing what you once overlooked." She held his gaze, unflinching. "Promise me that when you're sitting in council meetings discussing tariffs and treaties, you'll remember the servants who bring you water. When you're making decisions about laws and governance, you'll think about the invisible people those laws affect. When you're comfortable and powerful and surrounded by people who tell you what you want to hear, you'll remember the girl who scrubbed your floors while her father discussed military strategy." Calypso felt the weight of that promise, understood that she was asking him to fundamentally change not just his kingdom, but himself, to remain permanently uncomfortable, permanently vigilant, permanently aware of everything he'd once been blind to. "I promise." He said it like an oath, like a vow, like the most important words he'd ever spoken. "I promise to keep seeing, to keep questioning, to keep choosing justice even when it costs me. And I promise that if I ever start to forget, if I ever become comfortable again in my power and my privilege, you will tell me, loudly, publicly, without mercy." Cordelia smiled then, the first real smile he'd seen from her since that night in the kitchen. It was small and fragile and tinged with grief for everything she'd lost, but it was genuine. "Then yes, I'll stand beside you. I'll help you build something better. I'll be your conscience and your partner and whatever else this kingdom needs me to be."
She stood, offering him her hand. But I'm keeping the servants' clothes. They remind me where I came from, what I survived, who I really am beneath whatever title you give me. And they'll remind you, too, that the woman standing beside you was once invisible to you, was once someone you looked through instead of at. That's important to remember. Calypso took her hand, feeling the calluses from years of hard labor, the strength in her grip that came from surviving things that should have destroyed her. Then wear them, and I'll remember. Every day for the rest of my reign, I'll remember. They stood together in the garden while the sun climbed higher, two people who'd been remade by truth and trauma and the terrible knowledge of how badly systems could fail. Around them, Dravenmore continued its transformation. Servants moved through courtyards with new protections. Nobles adjusted to laws that limited their power. The whole comfortable order shifting into something different, something harder, something that might actually deserve to be called justice. It would take years, maybe decades, to fully dismantle the rot and build something better. There would be resistance, backlash, failures and setbacks, and moments when the weight of reform seemed too heavy to bear. But Calypso would face it all with Cordelia beside him, a woman who'd survived the worst his kingdom could do and chosen to help him build something better. A woman who would never let him forget the cost of blindness, the price of comfort, the necessity of seeing what others preferred to ignore. A woman who'd saved his kingdom by refusing to stay silent. And together, they would make sure no one ever had to again. The end.